I love the terrifying. You name it. Horror films, haunted houses, jump scares. I love it. My mom always used to ask me, why do you like to be scared? And to be honest, to this day, I don't really have a straight answer to that question. I'm not sure when that switch was flipped in my brain, but one day I stopped being scared in a dreadful sense and I became scared in an excited one. And there are plenty of people like me, those who love to explore the possibilities of fear. And because of this wide interest in the macabre, there's a seemingly endless list of types and genres of horror. The age of digital media and the internet, however, has created a new space for people to create horror narratives in endless different mediums and share them across a large audience. Thus is the birth of internet horror, which is also sometimes called analog horror or horror ARGs, also known as alternate reality games. However, as this genre expands and evolves, there's been an explosion of content and community members. So why has this style of horror become so all-consuming in the age of the internet? And in turn, how do these narratives achieve their level of fright using these new innovational digital media strategies? Well, to start, we must visit horror as a genre before the arrival of analog horror, particularly analyzing subgenres such as found footage horror and how they've contributed to contemporary horror narratives. Then, we were able to transition to the origins of internet horror, the formats and elements of analog horror, and what it means for our culture and what we fear. Horror places its humble roots all the way back to the 1890s with a French filmmaker called Georges Méliès and his film Les Manoirs des Diables, or, excuse my French, The House of the Devil. The film is only 3 minutes long, but contained plenty of iconography that would go on to define the horror genre, like skeletons, ghosts, bats. After this, there was only a matter of time before this genre steadily expanded into the 20th century, popularizing subgenres like monster flicks, zombie tales, Stephen King works, and one of the more persistent genres today, as well as my favorite, the slasher. Even today, mainstream film is evolving with horror, most prominently with the psychological horror genre that boasts the works of filmmakers like Jordan Peele, Robert Eggers, or my favorite, Ari Aster. However, the biggest horror invention of the last few decades occurred in 1999 with the Blair Witch Project. Back in the day, the film was known as the standard for an emerging genre called found footage, in which an audio-visual story was told through a diegetic camera, usually people filming themselves. Like many artistic novelties, the found footage genre was mostly born out of limitations. The Blair Witch Project was created by two young filmmakers, Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick, as part of a production company they created themselves right after graduating. This means the film had a pretty low budget, and in an interview for Filmmaker magazine, Sanchez breaks down their dilemma. So we asked ourselves, how can we really scare people psychologically and yet work within our budget, which was minuscule? So they took the element of horror that personally scared them the most, the reality of it, and transformed that into their film. In addition, they used the internet to their advantage in terms of marketing, creating a website with content from the supposed people in the documentary, which led people to believe that Heather, Joshua, and Michael, who in reality were just actors, were actually people who'd gotten lost in the woods. The Blair Witch Project has been analyzed by countless film scholars, and there seems to be a general consensus that the film's close relationship with reality through found footage, website marketing, etc., is in fact the biggest contributing factor as to why people perceive the film as so scary. In this case, the hypermediacy actually aids in the emotional influence of the film. However, found footage films like the Blair Witch Project are not the only early use of horror fiction on the internet. The most prominent example, probably, are creepypasta stories, which are essentially internet folktales that were spread throughout different forums and websites, often taking on a mind of their own. Slenderman is the most well-known entity created in the creepypasta classification, and is actually the origins of one of the first works of audiovisual internet horror. The YouTube channel Marble Hornets posted their first video in 2009 and was a project produced by film students that chronicled a man going through old video files of his friend who became mentally unstable in the course of trying to direct a film. As the series progresses, Marble Hornets takes the Slenderman legend and uses the ominous figure as the antagonist of their series, though they integrate the legend to fit the narrative being told. Another early example of internet horror is SCP, which stands for Special Containment Procedures, and is a lore-based organization containing eldritch horrors from around the world. SCP has gone on to be expanded into many mediums, including collaborative writing databases, video games, and short films. Projects like Marble Hornets and SCP are the early ancestors and essentially the catalyst for what would go on to become the analog horror genre. Projects like the Hypnagogic Archive, Gemini Home Entertainment, the Mandela Catalog, the Back Rooms, and my personal favorite, Local 58, have gone on to define the analog horror genre and spread its popularity. What makes analog horror what it is? Well, the signifying element of analog horror is exactly what it sounds like. The story is told through the formats of analog devices, and this could include a variety of things, including but not limited to VHS recordings, old camera footage, audio recordings, broadcasts, and first-person POV footage. But they all have in common that their main goal is to achieve fear through the realness of them. The stories become more real to us, but they also inspire distrust in the viewer, heightening the tension. But how have these mediums achieved this level of verisimilitude? Well, by looking at the subset of emotions that these narratives evoke from their audience, one of the most prominent is nostalgia. Analog formats are of a time before, whether you yourself lived through those technologies or not, and so they present an eerie dissonance in the viewer. Some suggest that analog horror is a weaponization of nostalgia itself. We were once in an environment that we associated with our memories and are now corrupted by the horrors that lay ahead. So, the format of analog horror itself is a large part of how it creates fear in its audience, but the content has also evolved to reflect cultural fears as they grow and change in society. One recent event that has become ingrained in recent horror creations is the COVID-19 pandemic. Mainstream cinema has fit a found footage style to the dreaded Zoom call in projects like 2020's Host, but analog horror has also picked up on these growing cultural fears and shared experiences. Bois Vert is a channel on YouTube that intentionally distorts animations in order to create a sense of absolute dread in the viewer. But many close readings of Bois Vert's videos interpret the story to be about the isolation and horror of someone who has been in quarantine. Just as Myrick and Sanchez discovered when they made the Blair Witch Project, these low-grade forms of storytelling are much cheaper to make than feature films, meaning they become more accessible for the average individual to create. That, of course, hasn't stopped analog horror elements from becoming mainstream, though, with recent films such as Skinamarink, illustrating inspiration and ancestry from analog horror. The director, Kyle Edward Ball, even created analog horror videos on YouTube before creating Skinamarink. This shows a completely new combination and meld of analog horror and mainstream film, almost showing a cyclical return from the Blair Witch Project to the internet back to mainstream cinema. Adaptation of analog horror stories has also become an option for mainstream cinema, most clearly shown in the announcement that the studio A24 would be producing a film based on Kane Pixel's YouTube channel that chronicles the internet phenomena of the back rooms. But despite all these different roads that analog horror has taken in recent years, there is a core idea that's been around since the early found footage days. They really want to scare people. Whenever society is new to something, people will always fear it, so analog horror is an opportunity to play upon these fears, as well as innovate the art itself. And to end, there's a fantastic quote from Eduardo Sanchez that I think truly brings together the holistic goal of internet horror creators everywhere. We definitely got as close as we had hoped to get to real horror.